How's it going, guys? Today we are continuing on with the build and installing a complete 12 volts dual battery setup. For this setup, we're going all out with our solar panels, an inverter, and of course our deep cycle dual batteries. I've opted for a KickAss dual battery setup on this build as I've heard really good reviews, and I think it's the best value for money as far as performance goes. It's also a plug and play setup, meaning that everything to install it comes in the boxes. So all that's left to do now is unpack everything and see what we're dealing with. So here's all my equipment laid out. We've got two slimline 170 amp batteries, two battery trays to store them with, a 2000 watt inverter, 25 amp DC to DC and MPPT solar charger. So it's time to move all of this into position in my van, and then we can go ahead and wire it up to the starter battery. Given that a lot of the 12 volt stuff is quite new to me, I find the easiest way to get started and not get overwhelmed is to lay everything out. And instead of trying to mentally comprehend the entire 12 volt setup, how it's going to be completed, just break things down one by one, work out all the information for each step, and then just go through one step at a time. So the first step in this process is going to be wiring up my DC and MPPT solar charger. Now, there's a lot of wires here, and to someone that isn't an experienced electrician, that's kind of intimidating. So I've gone ahead and opened up the diagram inside the booklet, and by breaking this down with all the equipment that it's come with, we can see this one here with the ignition wire is the set that goes to the starter battery. This one here that says solar is obviously the set that goes to the solar, and then this one here is going to our secondary battery. So the first thing I want to do is go ahead and tap in my ignition wire, which is only going to allow my starter battery to charge the secondary battery when the car is turned on. In order to do this first part, we have to run this blue ignition wire into a fuse terminal that only receives power when the car accessories are switched on. Now, in order to find out which terminals that might be, you're going to want to consult your user manual, go through and check which of the terminals correspond with which system. An easy one to tap into would be something like car electric seats. However, because my van doesn't have this, I'm going to be tapping into number 16, which is the electronic engine control. So now that you've picked the fuse that you want to tap into, I'm going to show you how to test that circuit to make sure it's only receiving power when the engine's turned on. This right here is my probe tool that I bought when I wired in my reverse camera, and I'm going to be using it today to test the terminal block. By connecting the end of the probe tool to a point on the car that's grounded, a little light is going to pop on in the middle whenever this point touches something that's live. So if we jump into here, you see every time that it touches something that's live, that little light is coming on. So this one right here is number 16, the terminal I want to be testing, and it's not lighting up with my probe tool. So the next step is to turn the engine on and test that fuse again to make sure that the circuit's running correctly. So that's shown us that that circuit is live when the car's switched on, and means that that is going to be a good terminal to tap into for this ignition wire. Now, in my car, I also have a second set of fuse terminals internally. So I'm going to be following that same process on this fuse block and find a connection that I can run to internally, just to make the running of that wire a little bit easier than coming from the outside of the vehicle. That wire has now been run behind my console. You can see the start of it here, followed through behind the dashboard, and it runs down here under that and is ready to be hooked up with my starter battery. So here's my little fuse blade tap, and we're going to be installing that there in this slot here with number 5. So here's my new fuse tap installed, which means that ignition wire is ready to go. With the ignition wire in place and ready to be connected, we now go back to the diagram for our second step, which will be connecting the starter battery to the DC-DC charger. Now we're doing this using the KickAss premium plug and play dual battery system wiring kit, which comes with everything we need to connect up to the battery, and then through the Anderson plug straight into the DC-DC charger. The battery inside my van, which is a Ford Transit, is located under the driver's seat. So before we can do anything here, we're going to have to move this out of the way so we can access that battery. The battery is now exposed and ready to install those wires to. First thing we're going to do when disconnecting a battery is remove the negative terminal. Then we can go ahead and pull off the positive. Add our new terminals in, positive first, negative last, and then we connect it back up, positive first, negative last. So this time we'll also be connecting up our ignition wire. With that Anderson plug all connected up, I can go ahead and run this wire to where the DC-DC charger is going to be. Now generally I try to wrap all my wires in conduit just to keep them safe. However, this right here is super protected in some plastic that's honestly thicker than the conduit I have been running, so I feel pretty safe leaving this as is behind the walls. That wire is now run to my DC-DC station, so let's plug that in and see how that's going. Flashing buttons is a good sign. It means there is at very least power going to my DC-DC charger. I'm now going to continue on and hook up my secondary batteries. Now, before I can connect up my secondary batteries to the DC-DC charger, I have to wire them in together in parallel to increase the overall capacity of the batteries without changing the voltage. So I'm going to quickly make up 2 wires to join them together, and then we can hook it up to the DC-DC charger. To make up these 2 little connectors, I've got, I believe, 2 gauge wiring and some 10mm eye terminals, and we're just going to cut this wire roughly in half, crimp on the terminals, and then apply some heat shrink to keep everything safe. We've got the batteries in their protective case that we're going to end up using to fix it into the van, but for now, that's roughly in position. So we'll cut this clean down the middle. Now we have to peel back the plastic, just enough to get the connector on. We're going to get all the ends looking like this and then chuck the terminals on and they're ready to go. I'm just going to slide a few of these onto the wires before I put the terminals on. Now I'll be putting the end of the wire into the terminal, crimp it down, apply the heat shrink, and my wires will be done. Got my 2 wires made up, so now we just have to go red to red, black to black, and these 2 batteries will be all connected up. So before we join the batteries, I just want to briefly explain how we're connecting these up to the DC-DC charger. These batteries will be linked together, but the 2 wires going out of them have to be on opposite batteries. This essentially makes it all one large battery and keeps the voltage the same and will drain them equally. If we connected the 2 batteries and then had our output going off the same battery, it would favor this battery more. This would become sort of a backup. They wouldn't drain the same and you'd have a loss in voltage. I'm also going to be putting on my Anderson plug with a inline fuse that will connect up to the DC charger. I'll now connect up my second positive to the other battery. So now we'll follow that same sequence to connect up the negative battery. We're also going to be putting labels on these wires because for me it's quite obvious which is which, but just in case anyone else comes along and gets confused by 2 red wires. So we now have the wiring for our starter battery and secondary battery finished. The next little cord in here to connect up is this black one here, and this little wire hooks up to a temperature sensor inside the DC-DC charger. We'll warm the system when the batteries are getting too hot and adjust the settings accordingly. So now I'm going to connect this up to my DC-DC charger, and there we go, more lights flashing. That's another good sign. So with the 2 batteries hooked up, the final step to get this done is to wire in my solar panels. So I've gone out and bought 4 Rhino racks. Now, in the end, we're going to be building a metal framework that will sit on top of that for my roof deck. But for today, I just want to get them hooked up to these solar panels so we can finish off this dual battery setup. So to install these solar panels to the roof rack, I've gone ahead and marked the center of the roof rack and then worked in 150mm from the edges. So then using tape to mark exactly where that hole needs to be drilled, we can go ahead and drill the holes ready to install the bolt. Now for the moment of truth, where we figure out if I drew my holes correctly or not. Fingers crossed. We've now got the 2 panels bolted onto the roof rack. It's funnier, I can just see your hand. So we've now got the 2 solar panels bolted onto the roof racks. And now before we install this, it's been brought to my attention that my ceiling needs a good clean. So we're going to take it to the car wash, get that sorted out, and then focus on installing the roof racks and wiring in the solar panels. So right here is everything that we're going to be using to connect my solar panels into the charger. We've got these 2 T-branch connectors which are going to run both panels through the same line. So what we've got to do now is cut a little hole and install this little cap on the ceiling to then run our wires through, and then it's as simple as plugging this in and then connect it up to our charger through the Anderson plug on the other side. My solar panels are 1300 long, so I've marked from roughly where they'll begin and just done a small pencil mark in the middle of the van at 1300. So I'm going to be cutting a square in the roof just a little bit smaller than this and then chucking this cap over the top to seal it. I've just got this little off-cut of wood that I'm going to be marking the sides to make a square out of, and then that should well and truly fit over the top of it. That should be good enough. So now I'll be using the jigsaw to cut out that square and then we can feed our wires through. That should be big enough to run my wires through, so now we just have to prime the sides so it doesn't rust and then seal it with rubber so it doesn't cut my wire. Now to protect that exposed metal from rusting, we've just gone out and bought some metal primer. I'm going to be applying that with cotton buds. And then to stop the serrated metal from cutting my solar wire, we've just gone out and bought some rubber, which I'm going to be applying to the sides of it. that should be pretty safe for my wire to come through. Now we can run my wires through this cap and then hook them straight up to that solar panel. So I now have my solar cable run through the ceiling, and unfortunately to get it through this cap, I have to disconnect the wires at the end and then reconnect them once they're fed through. Not ideal, but it does mean it's going to be extra watertight, so I'm just going to make the best of it. I was originally going to time lapse this part, but it's actually not as easy as I thought, so I'm going to show you how to do it properly. So this is how those cables look when they're made up. So to disconnect them, we have to unscrew this back bit, pull the front off like so. This part here slides off the side, and that allows the rest of it to slide off nice and easy. And we've got to take that back cap off as well. So now to get it through our cap, we just feed it straight through there. And now that it's through, we reconnect everything up from the other side. So now before I glue down that little cap, we're just going to be using some compressed air to get the metal shavings off the roof so I don't rust it out. Now that cap's ready to be sealed down, and to do that, we're just using some Sikaflex 221 heavy duty adhesive sealant. I'll be running a bead around all those corners and we'll push it down, and then we're ready to connect up our solar panel. That cap is all tacked off, so now we just got to get the panel on and connect up the wires. So now the next step here is to install the legs for my roof racks, and then we can slide that up onto the van and it should be ready to go. To connect the two solar panels up to each other, we've got these joiners here. Both of the positive wires connect up to this side, both of the negatives go to this side, and then that joins into the Anderson plug, and both the wires will be hooked up. We now have the solar panels and roof racks connected, so it's time to hook it up to the DC-DC controller. You can see that wire coming through the ceiling there. Just now we find my solar in Anderson plug and connect the two of them up, like so. Solar is now connected. It really is that simple. We now have my dual batteries connected, solar running. So now on to the final step for my KickAss 12-volt setup, and clearly we've progressed quite a bit with the rest of the van, but try to ignore that because today we're focusing on getting the inverter installed. This should be pretty simple as the inverter is more or less plug and play with the wires that come in the box. However, for the safety of our electrical setup, we do have to install a breaker on our positive line. Now, researching the correct size breaker for your inverter took a lot longer than it should have, because like everything in the DIY space, everyone's got an opinion and everyone else's opinion is wrong. But the best rule that I could find was essentially divide the total watts of your inverter by 10, and that will give you the size of the breaker you need in amp. So I have a 2000 watt inverter, and I'll be fitting a 200 amp breaker to protect this circuit. Now, I need to finish off my cabinetry before I can properly mount the inverter, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to connect it all up now so you can see how to do it at home. Before I hook up the inverter, I have to get my breaker installed on the positive line. So I'm going to be cutting my wire roughly where I'm going to have my circuit breaker sitting on the wall, and then the rest is free to connect up to my inverter. I've now got my two ends, which we're going to feed into the terminals at the bottom. To install the breaker is also quite simple. You just have to strip the end of the wire that you've cut and place it in this little sheath here. And once it's in, you slide that whole thing inside the breaker until it's visible on top, and then using an Allen key, you just clamp it down with this little nut here. Just go nice and tight so that whole wire is locked in there. It's not going anywhere. So now we'll do the same for that other side, and she's all ready to connect up. We now have our breaker all installed, so next is to connect up the positive and negative wires onto the back of the inverter. It's all labeled for you, negative on the left, positive on the right. Now I'll be connecting my wires up to the batteries with my breaker turned off, just for a bit of extra protection while we do this step. So since we're running with two batteries here, I need to connect up my wires in parallel so that the inverter drains these batteries at an equal rate. So simply put, with the batteries already connected to each other as they are, I need to connect the positive wire onto one battery and then the negative wire coming out of the opposite battery to create a complete circuit drawing through both batteries instead of just having them hooked up to the same one. So I'll connect up that positive wire first. Alright, that's nice and tight. So now we can do the negative. That's both my wires connected up. So now when we fix the breaker, we should see power come into my inverter. Alright, moment of truth. Yeah, there we go. So on the little LED screen here, you can see the voltage of my batteries and the output that they're giving at the moment. And that, my friends, is how you install a complete KickAss 12-volt setup. I hope you enjoyed the setup, and if you found this video useful at all, like and subscribe to show your support for the channel, because it really does go a long way. If you have any further questions or comments about the setup, feel free to drop a comment and I'll respond to you down there. And now, this was just a setup video, but if you'd like a full review of my KickAss system once all my appliances are running off, let me know in the comments as well, and we can definitely make that happen. That's all for today. I hope you're all having a fantastic week, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.